Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. Today, I'm going to take a look at 10 bands to win hair metal in the 80s. Was it a good idea or a mistake? Let's get things started here with Alice Cooper. Alice worked with Desmond Child on 1989's Trash in an attempt to pursue a more MTV-friendly sound, more hair metal-oriented here. And following the success of The Nightmare Returns, Alice released, of course, Constrictor and Raise Your Fist and Yell. And those albums are really fun albums. I think they accomplished the general feeling of, Alice is back, right? But they didn't chart as successfully as Alice would have hoped. So this album was his proper comeback record into the mainstream. And I think, like I said, Desmond Child was a perfect choice to work with on this record, both from a production standpoint and a songwriting standpoint as well. And this record yielded hits for Alice like Poison, his first top 10 hit since You and Me from 1977, Bed of Nails, and House of Fire as well. And Alice also collaborated with a number of musicians in and adjacent to the hair metal scene like John Bon Jovi, Steven Tyler, Richie Sambora, Joan Jett, and more. A lot of really cool collaborations on this record here. Alice can work with pretty much everybody, and overall this record is less heavy compared to Raise Your Fist and Yell, and Alice really doubles down here on a lot of the common tropes that everyone was doing around this time. Trash is ballad heavy, it's poppy, it's radio friendly, but it definitely paid off for him, and I wouldn't consider it a sellout. I mean, remember, Alice is one of the guys who made the ballad cool a decade before it became like a radio necessity, and so I'd rather consider this record to be, sort of another example of Alice being a musical chameleon in the same way that David Bowie was, able to adapt and show a lot of range, and, he managed to do so in a way that wasn't a total departure from the Alice Cooper sound either, and so he was able to bring in a newer generation of fans here, as well as being able to bring back, some longtime fans who might have fallen off the bandwagon with the Blackout albums in the early 80s, and so an immense success for Alice Cooper, absolutely a good idea here, and he continued on with Hey Stupid in 1991, very much following the same format as Trash, and these two records kind of go hand in hand, in my opinion, right? Another accessible record that was able to keep his commercial reemergence alive, even in a year like 1991, which is absolutely stacked with high-profile releases. Next up, Twisted Sister and Love is for Suckers. Twisted Sister are a really interesting case, because for most of their careers, they were lumped in with the hair metal scene anyway, because of their look. But I really never considered them to be a true glam metal act. I always thought they were significantly heavier than most of the bands in that scene, but their imagery made them very recognizable and very marketable, but they were really never able to escape the hair metal label given to them as a result. That's until they finally leaned into it in 1987 with Love is for Suckers. With the exception of the opening track, Wake Up the Sleeping Giant, this record is a total departure from the attitude and sound of the first few Twisted Sister albums, in my opinion, and instead of going for another heavy record true to their sound, they decided to lunge for a generic, by-the-book hair metal album instead, and one less attempt to revive their careers. Come Out and Play was a great record, but not nearly as successful as Stay Hungry, leading to a pretty steep decline in the charts for the band. This was originally supposed to be a Dee Snider solo record, but the label pressured them at the last minute, thought maybe it would sell more copies under the Twisted Sister name. Not so sure if it really worked out that way, but, was this a good idea? Absolutely not. I think it sticks out like a sore thumb in their otherwise flawless catalog. This was just kind of a last-ditch effort to get radio play, and it's just hard to listen to. Tracks on here like Hot Love, the title track, I'm So Hot For You, Me and the Boys, I mean, these are really boring, uninspired, generic tracks. The band themselves were not getting along at this point either, and the record just sounds totally unfocused and lame. Next up, Accept with Eat the Heat. For longtime viewers of the channel, you've probably heard this rant before, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. I'm kind of sick about talking about this record. I don't own it, don't want to own it, barely consider it to be a true Accept album. And, if there's one metal band that I would say, you don't ever want to hear make a glam metal record, Accept is that band. I mean, they're a band that I'm cool with every album kind of sounding similar, and they maintained a very, consistent formula throughout their entire careers, because if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? And there are some bands where I think it's cool to hear different experimentation, different sounds, different styles. Accept are not one of those bands. I kind of like that. I know what I'm going to get from Accept, sort of like an AC/DC or a Motorhead, right? They're very consistent in their catalog. This record sticks out, though, in a very bad way. This was a total sellout. After their incredible string of albums, from Restless and Wild all the way through Russian Roulette, Accept parted ways with vocalist Udo Dirkschneider and brought in David Reese for Eat the Heat, one of the most misguided rebrandings in metal history. I mean, just an embarrassing sellout of a record. David Reese was not a good fit for the band, and going glam was not a good fit for the band at all either. Definitely a mistake, but thankfully the band would reunite with Udo soon after and recover with a string of really heavy, underrated 90s records. Following that up here with Ozzy Osbourne and The Ultimate Sin. The Ozzy Osbourne persona had been really getting flanderized by the mid-'80s. I mean, just look at some of his music videos from this time, know what I'm talking about. His mainstream portrayal was, very cheesy and cartoonish, very commercial-friendly, and so taking a tamer, glam metal-esque look and sound for The Ultimate Sin made sense from a marketing standpoint. It's a good album. I think it's full of some really great deep cuts on here that I enjoy. Songs like Thank God for the Bomb, Secret Loser, Killer of Giants is phenomenal, one of my favorite Ozzy songs of all time. So there's a lot of really interesting tracks on here, but it really suffers from the production. Jake Ely's playing sounds so drowned out, and Ozzy has said he wants to redo it, and I think it's a record that definitely could benefit from a new mix, but in general, I don't think this change in sound was a mistake. Ultimate Sin seemed like the next logical step in Ozzy's sound and image. That said, I probably would not have enjoyed a whole era of, glam metal Ozzy, so I'm glad Ozzy reverted back to a much-needed, harder edge for No Rest for the Wicked 2 years later. Here's a terrible album from a great band that I never talk about, that's Discharge and Grave New World. I mean, has anybody ever listened to Discharge and thought, now this is a band that needs to go glam? I mean, of course not, right? Discharge threw all of their punk roots out the window on this record in an attempt to sound like a band off the Sunset Strip instead, and I hate this record. As a fan of Discharge, it's a complete and total sellout in every sense of the word. I hate Cal Morris's high falsettos on this album. It just sounds like a dying cat doing a Robert Plant impression, and it's awful and a total departure from everything fans loved about the hardcore punk legends, and it feels like a different band, compared to everything else they've done. Definitely a mistake, and one that would cause massive fan outrage as a result. New York City fans almost turned one of their shows into a riot on this tour because of how bad it was, and the band themselves split up by the end of 1986 before reuniting in 1990, and so if you could think of, one record that is the antithesis of punk, and everything that made Discharge stand out in the first place, this is it. Just a self-sabotaging record from a band who had no business pursuing this kind of look or sound in the first place. Next up, I'm going to go with Whitesnake from Slide It In through Slip of the Tongue, and this is the era where Whitesnake achieved much of their commercial fame and notoriety, right, departing from their bluesier hard rock sound for a modern glam metal look and sound on Slide It In, Whitesnake 87, and Slip of the Tongue, and this is a great string of records from 1984 to 1989, and it's a shame that this is mostly what Whitesnake are known for, though, because their early catalog is very underrated as well, but David Coverdale and company took really well to this era. I think it's one of the biggest factors, to the commercial success of the band during this time period was the guitar work of John Sykes. Like I've said before, a very underrated figure in metal history, and I think that his playing brought a lot of energy and fun to the Whitesnake sound. He made a lot of tracks on, Slide It In and Whitesnake 87 fun and engaging, and that could definitely be heard on those two records, Whitesnake 87 of which is a perfect album in my opinion, just from top to bottom, one of the best hair albums of all time, and changing things up I think was the right call for sure for the band, who adapted, a more modernized approach here, and this is a whole list of bands who tried to change with the times, right, or at least try to change with the hair metal sound of the 80s, but perhaps no one did it more seamlessly than Whitesnake did. Coming up next, we have Def Leppard. Starting with Pyromania, Def Leppard changed from a great new wave of British heavy metal group to a commercial hair metal act that became one of the biggest in the world, and personally my favorite era of Def Leppard is their early stuff. They lose me with Hysteria. I don't think I ever need to hear any of those songs again, but Pyromania is still enjoyable, so there's definitely signs of old Def Leppard still left, and otherwise this era of the band to me is pretty spineless and lacking the attitude of those early records. It's generic radio hit after generic radio hit. The band worked with Bob Rock, who knows how to get bands to that next level of superstardom, and Def Leppard became one of the biggest bands in the world, because of this change, and in terms of their success, I can't make much of a case for saying that this was a bad idea or a mistake, right, but for me personally, I checked out after their first few records as a result, but if I ever have to hear Pour Some Sugar on Me or Love Bites one more time, I think I might go insane. This was one of the first that came to mind for me, Celtic Frost and Cold Lake. Kind of what I was talking about with, Grave New World by Discharge. Extreme metal legends Celtic Frost are another band who have no business in or around glam metal, and it's hard to believe the band behind classic records like Into the Pandemonium, To Megatherion, and Tragic Serenades also are responsible for this stool sample of an album. it feels like a different band. And, it kind of really was, right? Featuring an all-new lineup of musicians except for frontman Tom G. Warrior, and guitarist Oliver Amberg was immediately fired after the album was panned, but I don't really think he was the problem here, I mean, this was a total sellout by Tom G. Warrior. This was his idea, his project here, in an attempt to rebrand Celtic Frost, to cash in on a sound similar to what Motley Crue were doing around this time. A huge mistake and a real embarrassment for Tom G. Warrior, who's called it the absolute worst he could ever do in his lifetime, and barely considers it a part of the band's back catalog, as it was omitted from their 1999 reissues as well, and rightfully so. Nobody wants to hear a reissue of Cold Lake. I mean, maybe it's musically sound, but it's not an album that I ever want to hear a group like Celtic Frost make, and so for me, one of my least favorite metal albums of all time, and, just a total mismatch for Celtic Frost, who had nothing to do, or should have had nothing to do, I should say, with this scene. Of course, Kiss tried their hand with glam metal in the 80s. I mean, there wasn't a genre or a trend that the band wouldn't chase during this period of time, from their unmasking on Lick It Up all the way through Hot in the Shade, so this album run here, Lick It Up, Asylum, Animalize, Crazy Nights, Hot in the Shade, right? These records here saw the band now following and taking notes from, some of the bands that they influenced themselves with their classic work 10 years earlier. And this whole era is a mixed bag for me because, I think it's full of really great deep cuts, but also some of the worst material the band ever recorded. Gene Simmons didn't have his heart fully invested in the band for much of the 80s as he was preoccupied with acting, and so you have Paul Stanley really steering the ship here for most of these records, and Paul kind of doing his best Bret Michaels meets Joe Elliott meets Vince Neil impression, all wrapped into one. And like I said, this era has some really high highs and some really low lows, but was it a mistake? I'd say absolutely not. Kiss were dying a death by the time they decided to unmask for 1983's Lick It Up. They had to do something, because making another great 70s style record to win the fans over again, it didn't work, unfortunately, with Creatures of the Night. No matter how much I love that album, and no matter how much, time has been friendly to it, it was not very successful in North America at the time of its release. And so if Kiss hadn't taken off the makeup and coasted the 80s by latching on to whatever was popular, they probably wouldn't have survived the decade. And lastly, we have Judas Priest with Turbo and Ram It Down. Now, this is one of the more puzzling cases of a band changing their sound, because Judas Priest were on an incredible roll after Defenders of the Faith from 1984, and I still don't understand, except for, money, why they felt the need to change anything with Turbo and Ram It Down, but they did, changing up their image and sound, using synthesizers for the first time on Turbo, and it's a pretty jarring change compared to the band's work up to that point, but I wouldn't say Turbo is a bad record. There's some really great stuff on here, some real hidden gems. Of course, Turbo Lover is, a live staple, but you have Locked In, which is great. Out in the Cold is awesome as well. And then you have some really embarrassing tracks on here too. Songs like Private Property and Parental Guidance and Rock You All Around the World, which is just terrible tracks, right? Just nails on a chalkboard type stuff, cringeworthy. And, Ram It Down and Turbo were initially supposed to be released as a double album entitled Twin Turbos, but they were split up instead, which I think was the right decision. Ram It Down is a heavier record. I think it bridges the gap between Turbo and Painkiller really well, but this era of Priest is a real head-scratcher for me. If it's not broken, don't fix it, and, Priest decided to change things up at arguably the peak of their career. Was it a total mistake? I mean, I don't think so, because, I do enjoy Turbo and Ram It Down for what they are, but I don't think they're top-shelf Priest albums by any means, and they returned to a much heavier sound for Painkiller that was a true return to form that they badly needed by 1990. So that wraps up this video here, taking a look at 10 bands who went hair and glam metal in the 80s. Some of these were good ideas, others were mistakes, and so I thought it was kind of interesting here to go down, the list of bands who changed up their sound to try to adapt to the times, and of course this is not a, full list, right? There are so many bands who altered their sound for the 80s. It was a very, different time for music, right? A lot of experimentation, a lot of outside influences, whether it be, new up-and-coming bands, whether it be MTV, whether it be hairstyles, things of that nature, a lot of which influenced, these bands to do something different, to stand out, to be more bombastic, but for whatever reason, some of these did not work out, and other times they did, right? So I got into that here in this video, talking about 10 of those bands. You guys can see them right over here, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know down in the comment section below, what are your thoughts on my picks here, and what are your thoughts on these eras of these bands? I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.